Hey everyone, this is Josh here with Invest with Matt. Hope you're doing well on this weekend. We got August right upon us, and I thought I would start a new series called Crazy Talk. So, in my bucket hat, which I'm going to refer to as my fuck it hat, I am going to go over the most extreme scenarios for equities, market conditions, crypto, you name it. We're going to pick a different topic, probably do this every couple of weeks and we'll go into like a crazy scenario. And I'm gonna go ahead and lead with that because these are not what I expect to happen. I am just gonna lay out what I think would happen given these certain situations. So, with that, we're going to start with our very first episode. And I thought it would be appropriate to pick up where I left off my three-part Perfect Storm series, which was with Ethereum. So, with that being said, let us consider what would happen if every bank, every payment processor, every stock, every on every exchange, every government treasury operation were to run exclusively on Ethereum. And you don't have to stop there. You can go to all world asset related items too. So you're talking about any kind of trading and bartering for items, products like I don't know, Pokemon cards, cars, like anything, mortgages, which kind of falls under the bank, I guess. But still, you get the picture. We're not talking about gradual adoption here, like over years. We're gonna say what happens if this occurred overnight, and the entire $500 trillion global financial system um, came down into a single blockchain network that was Ethereum. And I don't know that what market share Ethereum will end up with. We'll see. I don't think it really matters. I think they will have a significant role, at least for a period of time, coming up over the next 20 years. But this is going to be more of a thought of experiment, just to give you some perspective of how crazy things can get if everything were to move onto the Ethereum blockchain. So this is kind of the thesis for Crazy Talk here. Um, with that in mind, too, you know, things are already taking place right now that have the wheels set in motion for this. This isn't some distant sci-fi fantasy. Vitalik has outlined a pretty ambitious goal here of achieving 100,000 TPS, which is transactions per second on Ethereum, during their roll up of their scaling roadmap that he shared with everyone. And as institutional adoption is accelerating, it's accelerating faster, I think, than most people realize. But what if it didn't stop at gradual integration? What if the entire financial world went completely insane and moved on to Ethereum blockchain? And that's where we'll start today. All right. So the current state of Ethereum's 2.0 foundation. Before we dive into the madness, let's try to understand what we're working with. So Ethereum 2.0 currently operates with around a million validators, which secure around 34.4 million ETH. The processing is like 15 transactions per second, which is teeny tiny. That's small. Think of it in terms of like a coffee shop trying to handle all the financial traffic of the entire planet. But here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So there's a thing called proto dank sharding, and like every time I hear or see the word sharding, I think of people shitting in their pants. This was implemented in March of 2024. It's already reduced layer two costs by like almost 200x, and it can handle up to 6 data blobs per block. Again, blobs. I'm thinking poop here. We're looking at a system that's already 25x more powerful when you include layer two solutions, which obviously will be part of the solution for financial institutions moving on to these chains. Like at least for Ethereum, you're going to have layer twos, which you've seen with Robinhood and Arbitrum, and you'll see it implemented. With banks, they'll use some kind of layer two if they're going to be on Ethereum. Like most of this isn't going to directly happen on Ethereum's layer one. But those process over 240 TPS combined. So the technical foundations do exist. The question is, what happens when we push it to an absolutely ridiculous extreme? The scale problem. So from coffee shop to global economy. Let's put this into perspective here. So the global financial system processes around 50,000 to 100,000 transactions per second across all rails combined. So you're thinking of like everything is kind of interactive, but not. So like every bank has their own system, right? But they do have ways that they work together. And those different rails include things like credit card payments. So Visa alone handles 720 million transactions per day. Banking transfers, so Swift processes around 300 billion daily through 45 million messages. Stock trading, you're looking at like 100 trillion in global equity markets turning over pretty regularly. Bond markets, that's 130 trillion. A lot of people don't realize that the bond market is actually bigger. In outstanding debt securities, then foreign exchange is 7.5 trillion traded daily. Real estate transactions 2 trillion annually in the US alone. So if you think even broader scale, that number gets crazier. Ethereum's roadmap targets around 64 data blobs per block through danksharding, potentially enabling 100,000 plus transactions per second across all layers by 2030. But even if they hit their most optimistic targets, we're talking about cramming, the entire global economy through a system that's still being built. The infrastructure requirements would be pretty astronomical. Today's 1 million validators would need to expand to like 100 million validators, each requiring 32 ETH, which is currently around $120,000. So unless you got 120K sitting around, you're not going to be a validator. Plus, you have to have the hardware, which costs money too. We're looking at infrastructure investments in the tens of trillions of dollars. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I think since we're already moving that way, I think these institutions, these corporations, these companies, they will invest if they are going to go this route for finances in the future. With that being said, now that you have a little bit of perspective on like how crazy this would be, let's take a look at Ethereum and burn situation. Now, with burn, the economics become even more insane, really. Every transaction on Ethereum burns through the EIP 1559 program or contract. It currently has about 1,000 to 2,000 ETH that gets burned daily. I showed a chart on my Twitter the other day with all of the recent adoption. I think there was one day where it was almost 6 or 7K that was burned in a single day. And that's like where we are now, right? But if all of global finance moved on to Ethereum, we can do some quick math to try to think about how much Ethereum could potentially be burned on a daily basis. So stock trading alone would be $500 billion of daily volume that would burn approximately 500,000 ETH per day at current gas prices. So that's around $1.5 billion worth of ETH that would be destroyed daily. All banking operations, every wire transfer, every check clearing, every ACH payment on Ethereum would burn another 300,000 ETH daily. Real estate transactions, 200,000 ETH daily. Government operations would be 100,000 ETH daily. So the total burn of Ethereum daily, if everything were to be on their blockchain, would be around 1 to 2 million of ETH per day. Now, if you move to layer twos, it's going to be way less, but I'm trying to to paint an extreme picture here, like a crazy picture. So with that in mind, there's only 120 million ETH right now. I think it's like 120 million 0.71 ETH in existence. So we'd burn half of the ETH in just 2 months, if that were the case. And here's, the kicker on this. So as ETH becomes scarcer, the price will explode. As the price explodes, each transaction burns even more dollar value. And this creates like a vicious feedback loop. And it doesn't have to be at this crazy scale, right? This is an extreme scenario, but even on a smaller scale, as some adoption occurs, this feedback loop is going to happen. So that would drive the price that we know ETH to be today to some number that will sound completely insane. So when people hear Tom Lee talking about $10,000 to $15,000 in the next year, I think that's possible. I think that we could get there as more institutions dive into blockchaining. Like I said, we've already seen with Robinhood. We have other banks that are looking at this. We're looking at stable coins that they're going to use, which, of course, the majority of them are built on Ethereum. It's over 50% of them. So this is directly going to go, as an input into this crazy situation that we could run into. And let's just think of different scenarios. So the conservative scenario, you're looking at around if 25% of the global financial system was on Ethereum's layer 1 and layer 2s, you're looking at around a $50,000 ETH price target, which seems pretty crazy. Moderate 50% adoption. This is, from a house coffee shop to a neighborhood or a major business with hundreds of employees. If you want to think about it in that way, that's around $1 million per ETH. And then if you had like 75% on the blockchain, it's like 10 million. And then if you go beyond 75%, where you have like everything on there, it just, the number, it doesn't even, it would be like you couldn't even put a value on Ethereum. Much like today, you really have a hard time putting, what value do you put on the entire financial system? Like I know I said $500 trillion earlier, but that's like an estimate. It's really, there's not a value you can put on that. You can try, but it's priceless, for lack of a better. I'm gonna take a sip of coffee here. So now let's talk about validators and like a potential validator gold rush. So when the network fees hit trillions, currently validators earn around 3% annually on their staked Ethereum, and I have 5 staked right now with Robinhood. Thanks, Robinhood. Thanks, Vlad. But if networks are generating, 1 to 10 trillion in annual transaction fees from global finance, validator economics become completely unrecognizable for what they are today. The math's pretty staggering on this. So if 100 million validators split 5 trillion in annual fees, each validator earns around $50,000 annually just from fees before any ETH price appreciation. So that's like a 40% return on their 120K stake today if you had a 32 ETH, turning Ethereum validation into the most profitable activity in human history. Let me read that again. If this were to occur, if you have 32 ETH and you were running a validator, it would be the most profitable activity in human history. Who becomes validators, right? So Amazon, Google, Microsoft. So racing to control network infrastructure. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock running massive staking operations. Nation states, countries staking billions in monetary sovereignty into this, sovereign wealth funds, Norway's oil fund, Saudi Arabia's PIF, going all in on Ethereum. This creates a validator's arms race. So when controlling Ethereum infrastructure becomes a matter of national security, because it would, right? If we had enough of our national banks using the network for whatever reason. I was telling somebody about this the other day. It's like, well, the dollar is backed by the American military, more or less, right? So that's, part of the reason why it's so secure and why everyone uses it. Well, if banks start putting processes on the Ethereum blockchain, at what point of saturation do we need to be using ETH? Is it 10% of the stuff we're doing in the US that is tied to banks, tied to people's personal finances being on an Ethereum blockchain or any blockchain, really? That will pretty much make them also too big to fail, right? So if the bank is using this, the bank is too big to fail. So then vis-a-vis, Ethereum's too big to fail, which at that point means that it is backed by the American government and the American military. So it is, to me, as strong as the dollar at that point, as a global, I don't want to say currency, but as a global, what's the word I'm looking for here? I don't know, consensus, reserve currency, whatever. But the geopolitical implications of that would be pretty important. Let's just put it that way. And, you're looking at Validator returns, again, would be 200 to 2000% annually. And really, this feeds, it goes back into the feedback loop, right? The burn also becomes into. It gets to a point where if enough people are using it, that it gets harder and harder to get away from. And if people are profiting off of it, it makes it even less likely that they're going to get away from it. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, one of the things that I'm most excited about is the idea of real world assets moving on chain, right? So when everything becomes a token, and you can kind of see the different things here listed that can become tokens. So we're only talking about extreme here. So every asset on Earth becomes an Ethereum token. Your house, your deeds, ownership represented as an NFT. You want to sell, so you transfer the token. Need a mortgage, your house has tokens, gets locked in a smart contract until it's time for you to pay it off. Property taxes are automatically deducted from your wallet. Every stock, Apple shares, Google shares, Tesla shares, all as ERC20 tokens. Dividends are paid automatically via smart contracts. Stock buybacks would also be executed algorithmically through burn mechanisms, much like the one Ethereum has. You also would be able to do things like reverse splits, forward splits, just normal splits. All of that stuff can be handled by a smart contract. So it does make a lot of sense for why possibly we would want to move in this direction. Government bonds. So the U.S. Treasury issues, like I said earlier, there's 32 trillion in debt as smart contracts. Interest payments would happen automatically every block. National debt becomes programmable money. Your salary is paid in stable coins, automatically split into different DeFi products for savings, investments, spending. Your entire financial life would pretty much run through autopilot via smart contracts. You look at supply chains, so every product from manufacturing to sale of anything is tracked on chain. Your iPhone has a token representing ownership that transfers seamlessly to Apple, to the retailer, to you. Each of these creates, transaction volume, burning enormous amounts of Ethereum. Even if it's on layer 2, there are still network effects. Just the fact that it would be the predominantly used blockchain would make it valuable. So it would make whatever supply of Ethereum there is even more valuable. And it's not mentioned here, I don't think. It's not mentioned in these tables. But companies like Amazon and Microsoft are already looking to also have their own stable coins, and people are like, well, why would they do that? Well, it kind of goes back to this thing with smart contracts. So all of their things that they have, like rewards programs, that can be built into a smart contract. Instead of having like an Amazon credit card, you could have an Amazon stable coin, where you could have rewards, where it would keep your information. So when you would go onto their site, that's all you would use. That's all you would need. All your information would be tied to that token that you're using for that. And they could build whatever smart contracts they want to into that, to make things easier for their shoppers and better for them, right? So I think it's mutually beneficial for these larger companies to at least consider doing something like this. All right. And we're talking about massive amounts of scaling here, which Ethereum currently surely would not be able to handle on its own. So the technical challenges of scaling to impossibility, even with full dank charting implementation, providing 64 data blobs per block, 16 megabytes per slot, and rollup data, Ethereum faces fundamental constraints. I think everyone knows this, which is why it's crazy talk. Network latency says speed of light limitations mean the block times can't really go below 1 to 2 seconds globally. This caps the base layer throughput permanently. But again, layer 2s will be a solution to some of these things. Hardware requirements, current pure DAS testing shows the nodes need around, I think it's 56 kilobytes per second of bandwidth. So scaling to global financials scale would require massive hardware that could enhance the validators' state growth. So Ethereum state already requires 245 gigabytes of storage and grows continuously. Again, supporting global finance could push this up, to multiple terabytes, making node operation super expensive and centralized. Consensus complexity, more validators mean more communication overhead. The complexity of consensus would be a bottleneck for more advanced algorithms. There would be some pretty apocalyptic failure scenarios. So what could go catastrophically wrong if this were to be the case? So there would be a huge congestion crisis. So despite all the scaling improvements, network congestion makes, the cost of each transaction like $50,000. So only super wealthy people would be able to afford moving money. The smart contract cascades, this is another thing. Like if you have a bug in a widely used mortgage contract, it could affect, 100 million homes. Due to immutable smart contracts, the bug triggers automatic foreclosures. Like imagine that scenario on 100 million properties simultaneously. And there's no centralized authority to stop it. And that kind of goes to the point of regulation, right? If you start doing all of these things, like who's regulating it? Like what are the criteria for it? Like what can actually be done to make sure that this is safe for everyone? You could also have a validator war. So like China controls, I think it's like a third or 30% of validators. The use controls like a third. During a geopolitical crisis, they could block each other's transactions pretty much. So global finance just could split into competing blockchain factions. Blockchain wars, that has a good ring to it. You could have a quantum apocalypse. This is another thing that's really hot, quantum. So breakthrough in quantum computers, they could compromise Ethereum's cryptography. Every smart contract would then become vulnerable, and that would be like a mass issue, right? That's 500 trillion in assets that face like theft or manipulation all at one time. Infrastructure collapse. You could have a coordinated attack on the cloud providers for the hosting of Ethereum nodes. This could bring down like 2/3 of validators. And if that happens, then the network can't reach consensus, and global finance would just stop. And it would be a giant clusterfuck. So with that, let's think about like a paradise scenario instead. So what if everything goes right? And costs collapse, 95%. International wire transfers cost pennies instead of $30 to $50. Credit card fees go from 3% to 0.1%. This efficiency would boost our GDP by like trillions of dollars annually. Instant global settlement. Ooh, that would be nice. Every financial transaction settles in 12 seconds globally. No more 3-day check clearing. No more T+1 stock settlement. Markets become perfectly liquid and efficient. Financial inclusion revolution. So 2.5 billion unbanked people in the world gain full access to the global financial system through their smartphones. This would be huge. So this is a big problem in the world. A lot of people don't realize, like people don't have access to markets. So a farmer in like rural Kenya, could have a loan from a pension fund in Norway, with the loan automatically being secured by tokenized crop yields. Something crazy like that. Programmable economy. So money becomes fully programmable, which I think is where we will end at some point. You could have UBI, universal basic income, distributed automatically via smart contracts. You could have carbon credits into every transaction. You could have economic policy executed through code rather than through bureaucracy. This is where we're going. Like, on what time frame, I don't know, but when we get there, like, this is where the world wants to head. It's where we're naturally headed. I mean, I gave somebody the example the other day of like these things sound crazy, but if you think about where we were technologically, like relative to where we are today, right? So if you think about 20 years ago, then you think about 20 years before that, and then you think about 20 years before that, where we were, and think about the rapid changes over each section. So like each section of 20 years, it I mean, intuitively, you would say you feel like more is happening faster. And now with AI, quantum computing, in the next, I don't know, 10, 20 years, you would also extrapolate out the next 20 years and the 20 years after that going forward, that things will continue to scale faster and happen more rapidly. And I don't think people, yeah, I was saying to this person, like people have a hard time conceptualizing decades. They have an even harder time conceptualizing what can happen in 100 years. If you think about like what's happened in the past 100 years, things are happening faster. And I don't, you don't need like a lot of data to prove that. I think if you just ask a person, um, they would probably, if they're going on a gut feeling, would say, yeah, things seem to be happening faster now. Adoption of things happen faster. And if we have the regulatory frameworks and in place that are supporting this. So, like you think about crypto in general right now, the administration that we have is supporting it. So, as long as we have that and we're fostering it and we are careful about it, I think adoption will become more rapid than people think. I think it's going to happen faster than people think. I think 10 years from now, the next 10 years will happen faster than that 10 years. And the 10 years after that, things will happen more quickly than that 10 years. And so it's kind of like a compounding effect if you want to think of it in monetary terms. Sorry, I'll digress. Anyways, wealth explosion. So early ETH adopters or holders would be trillionaires in this situation. Their tokens would be like millions of dollars each. The economic restructuring creates a huge wealth transfer, probably the largest one in human history. So that's if everything was rosy and sunny and perfect. So we've kind of covered like what is bad, what is good, and now let's talk about like what could actually happen under these scenarios. So our reality check, the multi-chain compromise. So it's probably not all going to be Ethereum. Like if it were super, if you have an Ethereum today, at some point in the future, it might be worth $10+ million per token or per coin. But that's not the reality. So the reality is likely that all finance moving to Ethereum, it's probably not going to happen. Even if Ethereum's founders haven't acknowledged this, more likely scenario would be a multi-chain ecosystem, kind of like what we have today, right? It's not blockchain, but everybody kind of has their own ecosystem. And then there's other ecosystems that allow those ecosystems to talk to each other. So right now, Ethereum handles pretty high value settlements, or it could. So in a multi-chain scenario here, if this happened, Ethereum could handle high value settlements like reserve banking. Specialized chains would handle different financial sectors. Layer 2 solutions would provide specific use case optimization, so getting a little more granular. Cross-chain protocols would enable seamless operation and operability. That's a hard word. Time for mass adoption would be 2025, 2027. Major institutions experiment with blockchain rails. This is already happening. So we're already there. JP Morgan, Bank of America, Robinhood. There are companies like Profi and I can't remember the other one that are already doing mortgage settlements on blockchains. And to that point, I think their average settlement time for their mortgages is like 30 minutes or something crazy. So imagine if you could get equity out of your home in 30 minutes instead of it taking 2 weeks and having a bunch of paperwork and a notary come to your house and sign it. If it was verifiable and on blockchain, if you could do it in like 30 minutes. Anyway, back to the timeline. 2028 to 2030, you could see significant portions of finance operate on chain. I think we'll actually get there sooner. Honestly, I mean, Robinhood's already putting tokens for stocks on chain. Kraken's already started that. 2030 to 2035, I think you'll see that you'll have like hybrid systems that will dominate, with traditional blockchain rails will coexist with the current infrastructure. And then 10 years plus from now, I think the majority of blockchain based or the majority of finance will be blockchain based. The realistic impacts of what would this mean for Ethereum's price, because I'm sure if you're listening to this, what you care about. Even if only like 20 to 30% of global finance moved to Ethereum, the price would be like 50 to 200K, while burning 10, 20, 30% of the supply over the decade. That's still life-changing returns, without requiring some kind of impossible technical achievement. So the bottom line here is, to kind of tie it all up, with complete migration of global finance to Ethereum, as crazy as that would be, it would be astronomical impact to Ethereum. Partial migration, the more likely scenario, that's happening right now as we speak. And it's happening, like I said, faster than I think people realize. The technical roadmap does exist. Vitalik and the team and the Ethereum Foundation are targeting 100,000 transactions per second, which would be a significant improvement over like the 15 they have now. And that's going to be through roll-up centric scaling. It isn't a fantasy, it's engineering. They will be able to do it. The economic incentives, like I said before, they're aligning with policy in the government, at the government level and the regulatory level. And the infrastructure is already being built for this. We don't need 100% adoption for some extreme scenarios to play out. Even 25% adoptions will create those feedback dynamics that we talked about earlier. With the massive burns, people wanting to do, the explosive validator economics, where we'll get into like a validator arms race. And then just the funnel restructuring of how money works. The question isn't whether it will happen. It's really how fast it'll happen, in my opinion. And, how much and who benefits will be key. I think Ethereum is one of the best positioned right now. And because, first mover is such a huge advantage. If people start using you, they're probably going to stick with you, right? It's going to be harder to switch. Like if they're experimenting with Ethereum and they start moving things over onto it and start doing their smart chain or their smart contracts on that chain, it's going to be really hard to move over to something else later on. Like they're probably not going to, because it'll just, if it works, if it's not broke, why fix it? But based on the current trends, institutional adoption, technical progress, I think the answer is that there's going to be faster, more, and earlier adopters than most people expect. The extreme scenario analysis serves as kind of a boundary condition. Like I want to do these crazy talks to give you like the craziest fucking thing that could happen, and then work it back from there to like what could be. And having that upper, boundary to just have as a point of reference, I think is important in stocks, in equities, in crypto, in anything. You want to be able to know what the most extreme and the craziest, most apocalyptic thing is, positive or negative at both ends of the spectrum. And then I think once you have those perspectives, it's easier to kind of settle on where reality will ultimately be. While complete transition to Ethereum is in the realm of crazy talk, the partial adoption scenarios, when you work back from that, they seem, not just possible, but probable, in my opinion. And if that partial adoption turns into something bigger, well, then that's when, today's crazy talk becomes tomorrow's financial reality. And if we get there and you're holding Ethereum, I think you'll be really, really happy in 20 to 30 years from now. So that's it for the first episode of Crazy Talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I just wanted to kind of touch on this high level. I'll do more of these where we talk about extremes situations and try to put it into a perspective that makes sense in today's world that we live in. So thanks for listening in. Of course, like, subscribe. You can follow me on X at Oshua Hill. OSHUAHILL is my handle. But if you search for Invest with Meh, you should be able to find me. YouTube, Invest with Meh, and Substack, also Invest with Meh. So if you want to read my articles, I do some write-ups too from time to time on there also. Anyways, thanks for listening. If you made it this far, congratulations. 35 minutes, not too bad. I really wanted to do it under 30. Y'all have a great weekend. Take care. Happy trading. See ya.